All right, here we go. We are talking with Don Kounovsky. It's February 17th, 2025. And Don is 87 years old, so we're going to let Don talk for a little bit. So go ahead, Don.
Okay, well, my name is Donald William Kounovsky, and I was born on December 15th of 1937. And
Where were you born?
I was born in Hillsboro, North Dakota. That's about 50 miles from here, so I didn't get very far away from home. And I can remember very little, of course, back when I was that age. I can remember that at Christmas time, when I suppose I was 3 years old, we came home and there was a little chest made like a treasure chest. It was full of peanuts. And it had been made by a gentleman by the name of Edwin Gunkel, who farmed a little ways from us. But that's one of the things I can remember from being in Hillsboro, was this little peanut chest, and I still have it. So I have notes on it of when it was made and everything. So some of the kids might want to keep that because they know that it's old. So that's one of the things that I remember as a little kid. The other thing I can remember was that, and I think the history shows it was 1939, so I'd have been like 3 years old, and we'd gone to Grandpa John Kounovsky's, who farmed north of Hillsboro, about 5 miles, and of course there was no weather deal, but they knew there was a storm coming. And so my parents, I suppose, decided they better get going to get home. And we got as far as Hillsboro, and you couldn't see the road, so we stopped in Hillsboro, and my dad found a garage there to put the car in. And then Hazel and Bill and Hazel, my aunt and uncle, or my mother's sister, they had got stuck there too. And I can remember that we had a room in the Viking Hotel. And I can just remember my mother and Hazel walking around there at night, and it was storming. Then, of course, the next morning we went home, and I can remember that there was a lot of snow around the farm. So that's a couple of things that I can remember from way back when I was a kid in Hillsboro, or Kelso actually was the little town we farmed by. And then I had a friend by the name of Grant Anderson. Another little thing that I remember was he had a little boat, and there was it wasn't actually a river, it was kind of a little stream that ran behind the barn, and we put his little boat in there. And it floated along, and we kind of didn't watch it, and then we couldn't find it, and he was upset because we couldn't find his little boat. And finally, as we walked along the stream, and I think now, at the age I was at that time, which would have been, I suppose, 4, how could it be that my mother would let us walk alongside this little stream, although as I think back, it was probably only about 6 inches deep, so I don't think we could have drowned in it.
So can you tell me a little bit about your mother and your mother's family, what you can remember about Evelyn Kounovsky when you were growing up in Kelso, or maybe even once you moved to Fargo?
Well, on my mother's family, and I have lots of pictures, we have lots of pictures of it. My mother's family was 8 girls and 2 boys, so it was a large family, and they lived north of Mayville, is where they farmed. And the Lee family came from Wisconsin. There were 4 brothers that came, and they all homesteaded in the same area, so that they were always together, you might say, because that's at that time you didn't have transportation or anything like that. And my mother, of course, went to school in a small country school, which all the sisters did too, or I guess the whole family went to the country school. Then some of them went into town to what they called Mayville Normal and went to high school there. and a couple of them even got teachers' certificates. But Grandpa John Lee had been in an accident with a threshing machine and got hit in the head by what they called a threshing spike, which pulled the bundles into the threshing machine. And I don't know at what age that was, but he was never the same after that, I guess. And he ended up in the state hospital in Jamestown. I'm not sure what year that was, but I can remember when I was in the second grade when we lived in Fargo, and Grandma Lee came, and my brother and myself and my parents and Grandma Lee drove to Jamestown to see Grandpa John. And he sat by his bed in the dormitory in which he stayed, and he would look at my brother and he'd look at me and he would just say, Richard and Donald, Richard and Donald. He never talked hardly anything other than that. And he was in the state hospital then until I think it was 1952 when he died. So my aunts and my mother and that didn't really know their dad that well, except according to, we had a big birthday party in 1989 for all the sisters in Great Falls, Montana, and we interviewed them there, and from that I understand that Grandpa John Lee was a great walker, and he even walked up into Canada and tried to prove up a homestead up there, and he also went to Blaisdell, North Dakota, and proved up a homestead out there.
Where's Blaisdell, North Dakota?
Out by Minot.
And so he walked from the Red River Valley
all the way out there, down the railroad track, and tried to figure out how to prove up that homestead. I don't think he ever got it proved up, because then when they started drilling for oil out in that country, some of the relatives had to find out whether he had the mineral rights on it, and I guess they couldn't even prove up that he homesteaded it.
So what happened to Grandma Lee when Grandpa John Lee went to the state hospital? Where did she live?
Well, they owned a farm, and she had two boys, Howard and Helmer. And of course, at that time, when you were 12, 13, 14 years old, you did farm work. So they farmed. I don't know if they ever went beyond the 8th grade, but they helped Grandma on the farm. And then, of course, it was kind of interesting when we were doing this interviewing with the Lee girls in Montana, because Ovidia Lee was about, I think she was close to 15 years younger than my mother. And then my mother says, well, I was the one that took care of Ovidia when she was born. She said, I thought it was just like taking care of a doll, she says. So I'm sure the kids that's what they did, because they didn't go to town, they just lived there as a family, so you had to take care of each other.
I got you. So as far as you know, Grandpa John was no longer living there on the farm, but Grandma, what was her name again?
Grandma Lee.
Grandma Lee.
Olena Lee.
Grandma Olena Lee lived on the farm, and then from her children was able to stay on the farm and farm the farm. Is that right?
Yes. She stayed on the farm till she had to go to nursing home, and then the farm went to Helmer, and Helmer farmed it. Well, I guess Howard got part of that deal in the estate, and then when Helmer died, then it was all split up and went to the sisters and all those things that happen in an estate.
Okay. So now why don't you talk a little bit about your father, George Kounovsky, and what you remember about his parents, because I remember George's dad, my great-grandpa John, he lived until almost 1970. So why don't you talk a little bit about when you were growing up, what you remember about, George Kounovsky's family and where they came from?
Well, George Kounovsky's parents were both born in Bohemia and came to Chicago, and that was when, of course, people from certain countries were involved in. They lived in the same area in Chicago. I can't think of the little area they lived in, but
Sokol, wasn't it, in Chicago?
no, that's the Sokol Club you're talking
Okay,
about,
all right.
of which he was a gymnast.
Okay, that's fine.
But anyway, so they came, and then in Chicago, my Grandpa John was a silver gilder. What he did was, on picture frames years ago, they used to put silver sheets on it. And my brother still has the tools from him being a silver gilder, but that's what he did. And then apparently some of them decided that there was land that they could farm in North Dakota, and they all came here, and I can't tell you exactly what year that was, but they came, and then my Grandpa John was on a farm north of Hillsboro, and that's where I, of course, went and stayed a lot of the times with Grandpa and Grandma. And Grandpa John was a gymnast in what was called the Sokol Club, which Bart just mentioned. But that was something that he did in Chicago, and we even have a picture of him in his gymnastic suit and showing his gymnastic pose from the Sokol Club. But otherwise, they just came and they farmed, and they just did the things that farmers do.
And John Kounovsky never owned land, though, right?
No, John Kounovsky never owned land because he was under the idea that there's no object in owning land, because at some point the government's going to come and take it away from you, which had happened, I guess, to his parents back in Bohemia.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. And so then you were born in Hillsboro, and were you born in a hospital? Did we decide this? Did we figure that out? If you're ever born in a hospital, or were you born on the farm?
I guess I was born in a hospital or a house of some kind where kids were born.
Okay. And then you lived in Kelso, right?
Yeah, the little town of Kelso, which was 4 miles from Hillsboro, had an elevator and a school and a store at the time that I was a kid, and because we moved to Fargo in 1942, and the one thing I can remember about that was that my parents were over doing some work around the school, volunteer type stuff, and there was this store about 4 or 5 blocks down the gravel road, and he gave us enough money to go and get an ice cream cone, and nobody told me that you were supposed to hold an ice cream cone so the ice cream didn't fall out. And my brother and I were walking back to the school, and as we did, I turned my cone upside down and it fell into the gravel, and I can still remember how disappointed I was because I lost my ice cream.
So I'm going to lead you down a little bit of a story. This goes later in your life, but you ended up with the windmill from that farm, right, in Kelso?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there was a windmill on the farm. They had taken the blades off it, the big fan, but in the 1970s, this was belonged to Harlan Gunkel, is who the farm belonged to, and my parents rented that. And the reason that they ended up in Fargo was that, as I told you, my Grandpa John Kounovsky didn't believe in owning land, so that wasn't a big deal for my dad. So they rented this farm from Harlan Gunkel, or not Harlan Gunkel, Harlan Safford. They rented it from Safford's, and then my mother, because her side of the family all owned land, she thought they needed to buy land. So then in 1940, they decided that they would start looking around for land, and they found the land that I grew up on south of West Fargo. But of course, like everything else, they didn't have any money, so they borrowed money from the Lee family, which would have been Jake Bermadol, which would have been my grandmother's maiden name, because they had all owned land and had made money and had money. And my parents found this 240 acres south of West Fargo, and they paid $45 an acre, so it was $11,000. And we still have all of the documents of that situation where they borrowed this money and the interest was 2%, $220 a year. Well, the first 2 years that my parents came to Fargo, it rained so much that they couldn't even get into seed hardly anything. I can remember my dad going out with the horses and a mower, and I thought he was cutting weeds, but I guess it was wild oats. And they cut that and brought that into the by the barn and the house, because the house and the barn were on high ground compared to some of the other land. But anyway, they brought it in, and then he fed the cattle with that. And then Jake Vermidal said, well, George, because you've had such a tough time, you won't have to make any payments on the note. However, as time went on, he made the payments, and then after the war in 1947, I think it took 5 years, and then they paid off the note, and we have all of that, all of those notes and all those payment dates, which I can't quite remember exact without looking at them, but they did pay off the land in, I think, about 5 years. And then my dad said that he never wanted to borrow any more money to buy land because he could live on this land. All he had to do was pay the taxes and any insurance on it, and he could then just could live. And of course, my mother, if she would have had her way, why, we would have bought half of Cass County, because there was the other 80 acres alongside of their land that came up for sale, and my mother wanted to buy it, but my dad said no. He had been in debt once and he wasn't going in debt again. So it's kind of a difference between how the Lee family thought about land and things like that and the Kounovsky family.
So can you tell the story just a little bit? You told me before about moving from Kelso to Fargo and going from you had electricity to not having electricity, or do I have that wrong?
No, that's right. We had electricity.
And what year was that when you moved, if you remember?
For 1942. I think the war had started when they moved.
Okay.
I think they bought the land. If we could go and look at those records, right. But I think they bought it in 41, and then my mother and I came and lived in the house because it had been vacant for a little while, and she painted and all that sort of stuff. But then I think it was 42 when they actually made the move, and I remember my dad had a flat tire. We had a 1928 Chevrolet truck, and my dad had a flat tire by Grandin or someplace in that area, and he did manage to get the truck back to the farm at Kelso, but then we went to town because then there were restrictions on buying tires because of the war. And I remember going with him into Hillsboro to buy a tire for the truck, and he told me, don't say anything about the truck or the tire when I talk to this guy, because he made it kind of sound like the truck was still in Grandin and he had to get it home, so that would give him more reason to sell him a tire to fix it. So he ended up, then of course we used that truck to move, and I remember riding in that truck back and forth a few times to get everything from Kelso to Fargo.
And talk a little bit about the houses, though. Didn't you go from electricity to no electricity?
Oh yeah, when we moved to Fargo, there was no electricity, and of course that gets back to the same problem, shall we say. Electricity had come to the beach farm, which was about a mile from our place in Fargo, and of course I don't know how long electricity had been in there in Kelso, but I remember having electric lights at that time. So when we get to Fargo, then we had to go to all kerosene lights in the house and everything. Then with the war, we didn't get electricity at the farm until 1949. So we lived with a little gas and wood stove in the kitchen and an oil burner in the living room. And that just heated the whole house in the winter. So it was always cold upstairs where we slept. It, just the way it was. You'd grab your clothes in the morning and run down by the oil burner in the living room to get dressed because it was too cold to stay upstairs and get dressed.
Yeah. So, all right. So you lived for a number of years without electricity. You know, after having electricity in Kelso, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit about getting to and from school in Osgood? Do you remember that? Of being walking, and I thought you said you took the horses sometimes, and you get stuck.
Yeah, we had a Shetland pony, and we would ride that once in a while. And then we got bicycles when I was in the fourth grade, I think, before we got a bicycle. And of course, on those old roads, it was hard to ride a bicycle. But we were 3/4 of a mile from the school, and there was a field road across there, and we would walk that, which wasn't too bad. It was uphill both ways, but anyway, and it really was uphill both ways, because if you knew anything about the lay of the land out by the farm, which is now developed, there was a small hill which was about 10 feet higher than the ground around it that ran all the way from Horace towards West Fargo. It was just the way nature made it. So we had to go uphill to get to the school across this little hill, and when we came home we had to go uphill across that little hill to get home. So it's a true statement. It was uphill both ways, and we walked and carried our lunch.
And then what about in the wintertime? Didn't you take the ponies and get stuck someplace, and your parents didn't really know where you were because you didn't have phones, or was there some story like that?
Well, yeah, what happened was there was a storm that came, and the school was right along the river, and of course you could see better along the river with all the trees and that. But I think it was before regular. School was out at 4 o'clock, and I think it was before that the teacher said that it was James and Walter and June Montplaisir. They lived a mile beyond our farm out into the country, and or into the open. And the teacher said, well, you better get and they had a horse. They had a sleigh that was covered, had a little window in the front, and then the lines came through. And so they would come by in the morning and pick us up and go to school. And then the horse was tied up over in the Loberg's barn, which was right next to the school. So anyway, we started out, and by the time we got out into the open, it was storming so bad that the horse knew that the road was there, and we could just see a little ahead of it. And we got to our farm, and then my dad said that the Montplaisir kids would have to stay there overnight because the storm was so bad that if the horse would get lost trying to follow the road from our place to Montplaisir's, then that would be a real disaster. But when you look at it against today's world, Montplaisir's didn't have a phone. We didn't have a phone. People along the river had phones. But anyway, the Montplaisir family sat there all night with their 3 kids being gone. And can you imagine today if some family had 3 kids that they couldn't find because of the storm, and they couldn't call to find out where they were? It would be it was a different story then. And then it was storming so bad that after supper, when we milked cows, then my dad took a rope and tied to my brother and to James, who was the oldest of the Montplaisirs, and they were going to go to the barn and help him with chores and get that done. But he tied them to himself so that they couldn't get lost walking from the house to the barn. So it was really a big storm. And then the next morning, of course, it had cleared up, and then Gus Montplaisir came looking for his kids, and of course found them at our place, and everybody was was safe.
Wow, yeah, that wouldn't happen in this day and age, would it?
No, it wouldn't happen in this day and age at all, and everybody would be so nervous you'd think that they were going to lose the world.
Did you, why don't you just talk a little, you got any stories about you went to a one-room school, right?
Yes, one room country school, first to eighth grades. And then, of course, as the world changed, when I was in the fifth grade, then they consolidated into West Fargo. And so then we started school in West Fargo. And of course, here I was, this kid in the country, and we wore bib overalls. My dad was big on bib overalls. I guess I didn't know what a belted overhaul was. But anyway, here I come to school in West Fargo with bib overalls. So you talk about some kid being not actually harassed, but looked at because he had bib overalls. So it was one of the things that I remember well, because I suppose it was probably a couple, 3 weeks after that I was able to get a belted overall to wear to school.
And when you mean a belted overall, you just mean jeans, right?
Well, jeans, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Why don't you wrap this up just a little bit? Can you tell us a little bit about the farm work that you did as a kid, you know, when you started working on the farm and what you had to do to help out with your dad on your farm, your 240 acres in Fargo?
Well, we milked cows, we had pigs, we had chickens, we had everything that you have on a farm. So you could actually be self-sufficient if you wanted to, because basically all you needed was a warm bed and a full stomach, and those you could supply by what we had. But as a kid, you just kind of worked in. First you had to carry feed to the cattle and things like that. And it was just the labor that you did all the time as a youngster. And when you got home from school, you were usually expected to come out and help with whatever was going on around the farm. So it was a little different, and I always said that I would have probably stayed on the farm if my dad would have bought a hay loader, which is a deal that you pulled behind a hay rack to bring the hay up onto the hay rack, and then we'd put it on slings and pull it up into the barn. But we didn't have a hay loader, and once in a while we could borrow John Beach's, and that made life easier. Otherwise, the hay was bunched, and then you pitched it onto the hay rack, and then you took it over to the barn, and then you pulled it up into the barn. So there was a lot of work to that. And even in the wintertime, we used horses all the time to clean the barn. We had horses until the cows got sold when I was probably, I don't know, sophomore, junior in high school. But anyway, we would have to clean the barn, and then of course to feed the cattle we had cut corn with a corn binder and shocked it, and in the fall, if there got to be a little rain, it would freeze the shocks into the ground. So then when you would clean the barn, you'd throw it on this bobsled, as we called it, and go out and spread it out in the field. Then you'd have to pull these shocks loose from the ice to get back, to bring back to feed the cattle. So it was labor intense all the way around, but it's what you did. You didn't know any different. So if you didn't know any difference, you thought you were living good.
All right. Well, that's great. Thanks for those stories. We'll probably follow up a little bit later.
Okay.